management system guarantee the best of both worlds? These and many more I will be exploring with my panel on today's series. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel for today's conversation. We have Madam Bridget Jobonuku, who is a former vice presidential candidate of the Progressive People's Party, and all things being equal, she should be that party's presidential candidate for the 2020 elections. Let's welcome Madam Bridget with a round of applause. Also,
hello, everybody.
We have, hi Bridget, thanks for joining. Professor Henry Kwesi Prempeh is the Executive Director of the CDD Ghana. Welcome, Prof, and thanks for joining as well.
Thank you, Shamima.
Thanks. We also have the pleasure of the company of Nana Kofi Kwachi. He's a research fellow and doctoral candidate, New York University School of Global Public Health. Nana Kofi, welcome as well, and a round of applause to all of you who have joined us from across the world. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Shamima.
So we're jumping straight into our conversation. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us. I was reading a policy brief by the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance on managing elections in this COVID era. It said in parts, and I quote, "In a matter of a few months, the COVID-19 crisis has rapidly transformed fundamental electoral norms, practices, and approaches governing electoral management over the last few decades. The pandemic has therefore challenged numerous countries, states, and territories to rethink how to deliver safe, technically sound, and credible elections. This presents opportunities for growth, positive change, and innovation, and it incentivizes radical shifts in long entrenched perspectives." I'm starting with you, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh. Do you think this statement resonates with our reality here in Ghana in the way that the Electoral Commission has approached its role in this new normal?
Thank you, Shamima. I believe when the year began, one of the issues that the emergence of COVID in Ghana immediately threw up for debate was whether or not it was possible at all to hold the this year. And there was, I think, a very vibrant conversation, especially among a community of lawyers, constitutional lawyers, as to whether or not it was possible to even set aside or postpone the December 2020 elections in the light of the pandemic. I think that matter was put to rest when the government made clear that it did not intend to put off the elections. And then immediately that was settled, the other issue emerged of whether or not it was helpful, necessary, or desirable to hold the intended voter registration exercise which the EC had indicated it was going to pursue. That, I think, really detained us and for some time because it also happened in the midst of the lockdown. And I think the EC took a maximalist position that it was hell-bent on going ahead with a new voter register as opposed to just doing a limited registration exercise. As you're all aware, there was a considerable amount of back and forth on that, including finally precipitating in Supreme Court litigation over that. and related issues. And I think the matter was settled judicially in favor of the Electoral Commission, allowing it to roll out a new voter registration exercise within normally, an exceptionally compressed time. And I think that basically the general sense is that that exercise has been successful. We did not see any cluster of cases of COVID or coronavirus emerging out of that exercise. There were some initial concerns about crowding and the like, but I think overall, the judgment that one comes out with is that that exercise, notwithstanding the initial apprehension, and very justifiably so, has been generally successful. What I think that does for the next item on the calendar, on the electoral calendar, it could have one or two effects. It could either give us a certain false sense of security that because we pulled off the voter registration exercise, the election, we've settled it. We know there's no danger out there, and the election would go just as well. That is one possibility. And the other possibility, of course, is to say that, look, the election introduces other variables into the equation that were not present in the voter registration exercise, and therefore that we need to approach that as certainly informed by the voter registration, but not to think that it would be as easy as probably relatively we had the voter registration. And so far, well, I'm not aware of what it is that the EC has outlined yet. I do know that the voter registration exercise itself is not technically not complete because there has the exhibition of the register and cleanup and all of that, which has we need to know a clear roadmap, whether or not this would entail extending the number of voting days, whether it would mean, we don't know yet what the EC intends to roll out as its protocol for voting day, which has normally been a one-day exercise generally for the population. Is going to be a one-day exercise as opposed to the voter registration, really comparing apples and oranges to think that they will be the same. So I think we do need some direction, clear direction from the EC in the next few weeks or so, or months, certainly close the election, as to how it intends to mitigate the new concerns that would arise with voting day itself in the election in December 2020.
Thank you very much, H. Kwesi Prempeh, for setting the tone for our conversation. So yes, indeed, it would seem as if the registration exercise was a precursor to how the EC would manage or can better manage, the election getting into December. But the issue you raised about false sense of security, let me bring Nana Kwashi here from the public health point of view, because the challenge is, how do you ensure we protect our democracy and still protect the health of the citizens? Do you think that the registration exercise, Nana, and this is to you, gives us an understanding of the effects of the exercise on public health outcomes, seeing that we haven't recorded any massive cases as a result of that registration exercise?
Well, thanks for that question, Shamima. Good afternoon, Professor Prempeh, Madam Jagbenuku. Great pleasure to be here with both of you. With respect to the issues around the actual registration and COVID-19, I think what it gave us a great opportunity to do was basically to get a dry run of what really we have to do on December 7th. But it's important that we, again, realize that it's not an apples to apples comparison there. The circumstances on election day are not the same as in a registration. And a lot of why the registration was easy to do in this kind of paced out way was because we did it over multiple days in certain areas. On election day, if we go by the norm, we'd be doing it all on one day. And there's a question as to whether or not we've been able to, what we've learned about the multiple day process that could possibly be applied to the election itself to make it so that management and other things are easier. I think as far as infections coming out of such an exercise go, we go back down to basic epidemiology, which is that what causes a pandemic to spread is having the virus in circulation and how people behave within that environment. So if we have any activities that involve large gatherings or anything of that sort, we would expect to see more cases than we would have otherwise. That's just the reality. The question is how many, and do we have the capacity to really respond and contain those? I think there's where we have to, in addition to planning for what the actual election process looks like, given that we tried it out in registration with a multiple day process, that's where we really have to make sure we are collecting enough information to know what the magnitude of the risk is per se. There we can estimate things like how many cases are likely to be caused by mass gatherings throughout the whole day. So we can at least position ourselves in terms of testing strategies and other things to prepare for it. But I think the voter registration exercise gave us a phenomenal template for how to make sure things are done properly, and also what things can go wrong when there are tensions, when there are anxieties, and how we can better manage those situations to make sure that they don't become opportunities for mass spreading.
Thank you, Nana Kwashi. So, Bridget, I mean,
Yes.
as a political actor, obviously, COVID has posed tremendous challenges for even the big political parties. So I'm sure your party has had its fair share of these challenges, the mobilization, the activities, the campaigning. How has COVID affected political party organizing and going into the 2020 elections? What might be your expectations from the Electoral Commission and other actors to ensure that we don't, put our democracy on brink, and also put citizens' health on the brink as well?
Okay. Hi, Shamima. Thank you for that question. But first of all, I've said hi to HPC Prempeh already. So hello, Nana Kofi Kwache. I'm happy to be here to talk about this. Indeed, the COVID has really affected election. I mean, you can tell. I mean, this is the time for campaigning and noise making and big rallies and people rallying around, for lack of a better word. But we're not doing that because we are hindered by COVID and by the pandemic and the fear of spreading infections. Indeed, I think that to take off from what Nana Kofi was talking about, I think I saw an article from sciencemag.org online, which said that for some reason, Africans have developed antibodies to COVID and they're struggling to explain how. So, which means that a lot more of us might have been infected and not known it. The thing is, we can't take anything for granted, because I think for Africa, it was probably thought that would be the worst hit and would die in droves and people would be left along streets and things like that. But thankfully, so far, our numbers are small, probably except for South Africa. The deaths are minimal, and the cases themselves are milder, relatively milder than, yes, of course, we've had some 200 and some deaths, but I mean, comparatively, it's small. But then still, we can't take things for granted. Yes, indeed, the voters registration exercise was thought as one that would, spread the virus and, spread the disease. But as H. Kwesi Prempeh said, it seems as if it was successful if we're thinking in terms of the pandemic. Like you said, it's not the same. The voters registration exercise was over a number of days. So therefore, people are spread out. People take their time to go to the station, the registration centers and all that. But in this case, it's going to be a one day event. I wish that the Electoral Commission would have been here to tell us if it would be more than a day, or if they could consider, because of COVID, make it more than a day. And therefore, what mechanisms they could put in place to safeguard that people are not disenfranchised, or their votes, everybody's votes is counted, and there's not a lot of there's always violence, so there won't be violence. But if you're talking about, yes, how it's affected active voting, campaigning activity, it has a lot. For example, when I needed to get nominations for to file my nominations, I couldn't go to the constituencies to meet with, or the regional executives to meet with the regional executives. It had to be done over phone, and to say, you know what, or you send me your nomination by WhatsApp so that there's evidence that you actually nominated me. So in ways like that, we've had to rely quite heavily on technology, which is a good thing. I mean, if you think about it, it's a good thing because we are all trying to progress and move forward. But I don't know whether technology will be doing it for us when it comes to the actual day of voting, December 7th. And we hope that the EC is putting in measures to ensure that that doesn't, whilst we are minding that we don't increase infections, we also do not disenfranchise people. We must be aware that today, from tomorrow, our airports are opening, and our first few cases of COVID came in from outside. And whilst they say that we have put in measures to ensure that everybody is tested, a lot of people were stranded outside, and they're going to come in, and we have to make sure that, well, between now and December 7th, if they do have it, they have recovered, and our numbers are on the decline. And if they are not, then probably other practical measures will have to be put in place. And we look forward to hearing from the EC about what some of these practical solutions are. But I have a few, and maybe when we get there, I'll share that with you.
That thought, keep that thought. If you just join us, it's the University of Ghana School of Law seminars. It's the elections series, and we are discussing elections and pandemics. We want to explore pathways to innovative elections management. So this next set of questions comes to you, Nana Kwakye and Professor Prempeh. Often it's said that the health risk of a pandemic require a choice as to what should be prioritized, whether the health of citizens and that of the nation's democracy. So Nana Kwakye, I'm asking you first, what might happen between now and December that might lead to a decision being taken, you propose, to prioritize health outcomes over the democracy in the worst case scenario that you would say postpone these elections as a result of this? And H. Kwesi Prempeh, immediately after Nana Kwakye, you should also tell me where you'd lean towards. Would you choose democracy over the health concerns in a worst case scenario situation? Nana Kwakye, you first.
Okay, so to answer the first part, what could, what kinds of things could go against us in the fight against COVID between now and election day? I think the most obvious one comes from the easing of restrictions and non-compliance. We've seen that, yes, there are some people wearing face masks and doing the hand washing and doing the physical distancing, but it's just difficult to believe that that's in the majority. That just does not appear to be the case. And where people get more and more relaxed as time goes on, if they get too relaxed, we could see resurgence of cases. There's that issue. Then there's a question of the border reopenings, for example. It's important to put this all in context with the global picture, because that's what we're talking about when we talk about air traffic. Europe right now is in a situation where some countries and some regions in some countries are considering a second wave of lockdowns because they're seeing a surge in cases. We're seeing that in Asia, we're seeing that in the Americas, and those are the large sending countries if we think about that in terms of air traffic for Ghana. So it's great that we're going to require the PCR testing before they come. It's good that we're going to do antigen testing, but we have to be frank with ourselves that it's possible that some people will slip through the cracks. And those, if we don't manage those or contain those well, could lead to larger outbreaks. But I think those are the two main risks that we're facing right now. Rising false sense of security and low compliance, and then the risk of importation and starting of clusters through there. I think those are all real risks. Now, on the question of how you weigh it out in the grand scheme of things, I think many countries have had to answer this question this year. As of May, I believe there are 55 countries around the world scheduled to have some form of legislative or presidential election this year that reschedule them entirely. Poland, for example, decided they're going to go all postal. South Korea went with early voting. Israel went to PP for health workers, but countries are trying to figure this out critically. And I think in our context, we have to be very keenly aware of what figuring it out really means, because we know that elections here are hotly contested. There's always a lot of tensions, a lot of anxiety. I mean, I was very young in 2008, but I do recall the tension in that particular election. I think most of us would remember it. And so we know that when it's on a knife's edge, you don't want to introduce any additional variables that could make the situation unpredictable. So the easiest way to do that is to make sure that we have, going to December, the epidemic in Ghana under firm control, where we're seeing lower infections, lower hospitalizations, and where we're seeing those things while we are still testing at a reasonable enough capacity to draw, practical conclusions from the data we're getting. But I don't really see a scenario where, given the nature of politics here and the general tensions around our elections, where if we are going to have a postponement or any kind of change in the usual format, we have to give those kind of notices now and walk through those scenarios to the political parties now, so everybody can be primed for it in some sense. Because the concern there is, if these are decisions that have to be made last minute, just because of emerging events with the virus, I don't see how those yes will protect health, but we also know the country we live in. We know the realities of our political system and the electoral happenings, and we know that kind of a scenario, you just need one party saying, we're not going to agree to this, and you have a problem on your hands. So those are the kinds of things that we have to be mindful of. So to avert that scenario, the easiest way really is to double our efforts between now and then to make sure we have the epidemic under control. And like I said earlier, that also means that we have to know that for a fact, which means we have to test at the right levels. We have to do quarantine isolation in the right ways. And we have to make sure that our contact tracing is sufficient enough for us to know that we actually know that we're in a good position going to the election.
Right. Nice. Kwesi, so obviously from Nana Kwaku's point of view, democracy would trump whatever health concerns that might arise, no matter how severe even.
Well, I not necessarily, even though I agree with him completely that, this kind of balancing, I mean, usually when you have two significant interests, the health of the public citizens and the health of the democracy, our democracy in this situation, you have two equally weighty considerations or interests, almost clashing in a situation like this. You normally do a balancing act that really doesn't, it's almost like a compromise. You work a midway where each one gets a little bit and we're all satisfied at that level. This, unfortunately, is not that kind of a situation, right? Certainly not in our case. We don't want to compromise on democracy, whatever that means, right? You don't really want to cut corners on democracy because it's the source of the legitimacy of government. And so we want to have our democracy, and we do not want to have it at the cost of our lives. So this is a situation where you really want to have both. You want to really have your cake and eat it. And if we were going to contemplate a situation where elections would have to be put off, I'm afraid that time, we really do not have the time to do that. When the elections, when the question of the elections and its occurrence arose in the early days of COVID, or in the early months or weeks of COVID, I thought that my expectation was that we would have at least a plan B, even if we had come to the conclusion that, look, when you look in the four corners of the Constitution, there doesn't appear to be any leeway for us, right? Unlike voter registration, where in fact it was somewhat optional, it is not constitutionally required that you have a new voter registration. It is constitutionally required that you have an election this year in December. And there doesn't appear to be within the text on the what I call the four corners of the Constitution, there doesn't appear to be really much leeway that has been left for us to postpone an election of this kind or to move it beyond the set dates that we have, say, by a month or two or the like. So we are actually constrained by the supreme law of the land that governs our republic and that governs elections. And in that kind of a situation, if you were faced with a worst case scenario, of course, like we say, a constitution is not a suicide pact. That merely because you have a constitution doesn't mean that even if it's going to spell doom for all of you in terms of your existence, that you would really go ahead with it. But if that was the situation, it would require a national consensus. It would require that the political class, the citizenry come to a real national consensus that this election needed to be postponed. Populace was at risk. But I don't think we have a plan B. I don't think the political class has engaged with each other on this issue. And if they have, I do not know of the existence of a plan B. And the West would be to really wait, and like Nana said, to really wait last minute, and then to say that, oh, look, we didn't really anticipate that it would get this bad. The second wave is way worse than the first one. And under these circumstances, we cannot have an election. If that declaration were to be made by one party, being the incumbent party, I mean, we can all anticipate that basically that is not going to work in our circumstance. We would be faced with a real constitutional crisis. So I really, I think it's a tough question, how to do the balancing. I think probably the optimal resolution, if that were the case, would be to come to some understanding that you draw out voting day ways of doing the election, because I do not think that we are already in the almost entered the third quarter soon, and the last quarter, and because we haven't already agreed a plan B, if we really want to think of a worst case scenario, probably all stakeholders must come to an understanding that in the event of a worst case scenario, we do it. And it's going to take a lot of political bargaining to come to that agreement. We haven't tried that yet. And in the situation that Nana just really painted very accurately, that our politics is extremely competitive, highly divisive, highly zero-sum, highly toxic almost sometimes. And I do not see that atmosphere as being the atmosphere in which you engender the kind of consensus that would be needed if indeed we were faced with a worst case scenario. So I really pray that we don't have a worst case scenario, which would be the typical Ghanaian thing to do. And yet, even if we didn't have a worst case scenario, I think the issue, the public health issues and other issues still remain. We don't really have to have a worst case scenario for us to still a plan C or how we deal with this situation. I think the virus, for some reason, it's no longer foremost on our minds. I have traveled, I've been to travel the country in the last 3 or 4 weeks. I've been to Bolgatanga by road, to Tamale by road, to Sunyani, to Kumasi, and then to Takrady. And it's clear, I mean, when you just observe as you travel the country, that basically people are just taking it easy. People are taking it easy. And I think the relatively low mortality numbers put in the context of what else we know is happening in the world has really led a number of us to think that, look, the West is over here. And it would be a real surprise if we got hit by a worst case scenario and there's a huge flare. I don't think we are prepared for it at all. Not the citizenry and certainly not the political class.
Wow, that's an obvious stark picture you paint there. So let's pray. Let's Solemo and keep praying that we don't have that worst case scenario. Bridget, I mean, as a political actor, would you or your party, acquiesce to any conversation about a plan B possibly, even if we were to decide that, of course, this election is coming off December 7, come what may, but how do we deploy the election management system? Is it going to be a single day? And Kwesi had mentioned it in his previous comment. These things we haven't even started talking about. Are we doing a one-day event? They're going to be, of course, there's always the special voting. Are we going to have an expansive special voting and expand the groups or institutions that would, take part in that special voting? As a political actor, what might be your ideas of a possible scenario planning process?
Well, thanks again. I like that question. I keep saying that the pandemic, COVID, has given us the opportunity to do things right. It's in all ways, in our funerals, all our social events, we've been given just the perfect opportunity to do things right, in detail, properly. And yet we just want to carry on along the same lines. And, there are people who I know are waiting to have their big social events when COVID is over, and we still don't know when COVID will be over. And therefore, yes, we need to carry on with what needs to be done, but maybe think around it and do it properly. And you've given me a brilliant idea as well, which is the pre-voting that they used to do. Maybe they have to do a few days before. But we know that when they do the pre-voting, then people, of course, people count, and they know that, oh, this party or that one is doing well on this day amongst these group of people. And therefore, the violence or the electoral, there's a word for it, the cheating starts the next day, because people know, oh, gosh, we might be losing out in this area or in that area, and therefore let's start, the violence and the stealing of ballot boxes and things like that. But I think that, yes, it gives us an opportunity to think about it and say, how better can we make our electoral process and our voting process on 7th December? And some of the things we've thought about, maybe with the pre-voting, would be to get people who are vulnerable to go first, go earlier, line up first, and we give them a number of hours within which they can go and vote. And when you've done that and you're gone, or the time is gone, if you go after that, then you'll have to join the queue for the next group of people, so that they group the voters in a manner that ensures that a certain number is there at a time. And obviously we take care of the vulnerable, the aged, the physically challenged, and all those people. They come and go before the others come. As Nana said, he was very young in 2008. If you think 2008 was violent or was near violence, try now, because the two major parties are really charged, and it then becomes our responsibility as the third party to stand between them and be the people to say, oh, stand aside. I think in 2016, we came between the two parties on the ballot paper, and I said to them that we are there to separate their fights. So this is what we are here for. And if you think 2008 was charged, you should try it now. I think that there's a lot at stake. So the Electoral Commission, if they were here and if they're going to get excerpts of this conversation, they might have to start thinking about how to segment the demography so that We have the handicapped, we have the elderly, give them a few hours in the morning when the voting starts, they go and then they leave. Because I think research and, after several years of voting, we know that it's towards the end of the day when they have to count ballots that they have to count the votes. That's when the violence actually begins. Of course, sometimes it begins there, but begins whilst the voting is going on, but not so much. And then, of course, to ensure physical distancing, look at the numbers that will come, each constituency and each voting, help me here, what's the word for the polling station? Each polling station has the number they have on their list for the number of people who are coming to vote. So they can use that to say, we won't have as many people, so many people, or more than a certain number of people at the polling station at a time, and therefore phase the people out gradually. And of course, it might require a little more budget for the election, but it's either you have the budget for the election to ensure that people are not getting infected, or you have the budget for the health. So one way or other, it's got to be shifted around and ensure that that is done. You have a lot more electoral officers there at the polling stations, so that nobody stays in the queue for too long. They get there, they can vote, and then they can go. And of course, I think we, the political parties as well, must have an interest in how that goes, to ensure that, nobody knows which vote is coming to your party, but just to ensure that you have the interest of the voters at heart. Everybody should be there to ensure that these things, when they are put in place, are adhered to, so that the health, the health aspects of it is ensured. We can't be 100% sure, but when you put these things in place, as we said, the vulnerable will be taken care of, and then the rest of us can, of course, our masks and all that, sanitizer, hand washing, and all that. And I think that it's also up to us as a political party. If you must provide these things. It doesn't matter who the vote is going to, but we just want to ensure that the Ghanaian is safe and healthy during the electoral process on that day.
Brilliant. So, as a political actor, I think the question is, are you worried that we're not having the conversation around, fleshing out these details in terms of how will the voting day pan out?
Oh yes, I am. I am. You see, and that's what I meant by, we seem to think that COVID will go and then we'll continue as we were, and I think, as we said, COVID has given us an opportunity to do things better. Nobody is, most times when we have these conversations, it sounds as if we are criticizing and we are putting the EC on the spot, but we are not. We are proffering ideas as to make things better for everybody. And like I said, we must probably take this conversation to the EC if they won't come, to say this ought to be done. Because I know that if by December 7th, we are still recording cases in the hundreds by the day, or there's a spike because we, opened our borders, people won't go out and vote. People will, and I know that there are certain people who refuse to go and register because they just couldn't, they were afraid to put their lives at risk. Yes. So we must have these conversations, and the EC must be seen to be saying something about it. And we're in September. We have October and November. Maybe the public, maybe the NCCE, for example, could take on the duty of informing people as to what the EC is doing for safe voting on December 7th. And if there are no plans, they should put them in place. The fact that we've, opened our borders and laid aside all the safety protocols does not mean that COVID is gone. It's not. We all know that.
Definitely, it isn't. But I think that usually the results of the early voting are not counted on the day of the voting. They are usually added to the general population's vote and counted after 7th.
That is what it ought to be, but is that what it is?
So we'll see. Is that what it is? We'll find out. Right. Let me bring Nana Kwachi, if you're still on, which you should
I'm here.
be. I want us to look at some of the risk factors. So
Okay.
assuming that now December 7th will come and we are going to the pools, what must we put in place to ensure the safety of citizens? For instance, there's the saying that for public health decisions, the considerations are usually about the time and the place factors. The time being that we would hold an election within a stipulated period of time for the general population, which is a huge number, you know, for a particular day. The place being you having to physically go to a polling station to cast your vote. So from the public health point of view, what might we do to provide a safe environment for both voters and poll workers and minimize the health risk associated with electoral operations in a pandemic?
Okay, thanks for that. So again, it goes back down to how we look at our struggle with COVID-19. It would be a mistake to view the precautions we have to take around the election as an event that we have to do close to time. It's things we have to be doing now. It's about making sure that we are enforcing physical distancing. We are being conscientious and intentional about observing and keeping down infections in schools when they reopen. It's about making sure that in other parts of our social and public life that we've reopened, in religious institutions, and in reality, the bars and clubs that are open and stuff like that, we need to make sure that all those things that will create a bad situation for us then in December are not happening now. Because when the interventions we do now don't have an immediate effect, they're going to have an effect 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the line. So we need to be working now to make sure that we're in that position. But going into the actual election day, we need to make sure, obviously, that we can take care of physical security so that people can be protected from catching the virus by virtue of physical distancing, enforcing mask wearing, and all those things. But that's where, again, we come down to practical considerations. I grew up in Latibia-Koshi, across from Bishop Barrow School, which was a polling station. And every election day, you'd see, it was large numbers there voting. And at the end of the day, there'd be large crowds gathering. What are the practical steps we can do if by virtue of the electoral process itself to reduce those circumstances? Because this is a situation where you can't do, there's no like testing or tracing innovation that makes it so that the election environment itself is safer. That's a question of the structure of the election and the decisions you make around how is it going to happen. Like Madam Jagbenuku said, we can be doing things like early voting. We can be doing things like, special voting or special queue assignments for vulnerable people. But we need to know what things are consensus positions from the different political actors. So then we have an agreed upon set of things we can choose from to say we're going to mitigate risk this way. And that's why I think a lot of the conversation about the worst case scenario planning, I really hope that it's happening or that it happens soon, because we need to have different scenarios that we plan for, where we know what tools we can use in the different scenarios to really minimize the risk of infection if we are going to have the election, if we go through with it. And those are not decisions public health people can make. Those are administrative decisions that the Electoral Commission has to make. But I think from a public health perspective, what we'd want to see, obviously, is some recognition that a multiple day registration event is not the same thing as a single day voting. So you cannot say that because you did one, the other is automatically going to be safe. And if that is the reality, what are you doing about the latter scenario, the single day scenario, to make it so that it's safer? Which means maybe at a single polling station, can you have multiple ballot boxes so that you have people spending less time there? Can you make sure that as much as possible, polling stations are outdoors so there's good ventilation? Can you make sure that as much as possible, that if people want to observe, that you pick a location for the polling center where if even people are going to mass up to observe, they're not crowded in to observe, whether maybe it's a big field like in ironically, like in Ayasu West Wuogon, like the Laobao Leisure Park, that's a huge area where if you're voting there, people can make a single line, single file line around it where people can see what's going on. So it's about those strategic decisions to make it so that we are reducing the risk of gathering, reducing the risk of crowding, while at the same time, in the way we structure the electoral process, being flexible, being pragmatic, and doing those things in a way that leads towards broad consensus. Because there's also no scenario where we have a list of public health measures we can put in place as ad hoc mitigation measures that are not previously agreed on by other political parties. That's going to be a problem. And it's important that we in this particular instance do the thing I think has been lacking in a lot of our COVID response, which is plan for the worst case. Don't plan for the best case and hope it happens. Plan for the worst case and hope it doesn't. So that we have adequate provisions, adequate consensus, adequate public perception and perspective about what the priorities have to be if A happens, if B happens, if C happens. So it wouldn't make sense for us to say, like Madame was saying, that we're in a good place, so we can relax and things will be fine. We have to assume that they will not and plan for that, and then work to make sure that they are actually in a good place when we get to December 7th.
Right. Thanks. So that's from the public health point of view. For the democracy point of view, HKC, I mean, the sweeping restrictions obviously pose a challenge in terms of limiting the participatory dimensions of our democracy. So, I mean, from your governance expert point of view, how can we ensure that the process is credible and, these issues of voter suppression that we have already had, even with the registration exercises, eliminated towards the main day itself? And how can we guarantee that the election will be representative and legitimate in the face of all of these sweeping, restrictions?
Yes, no, I think that's a very crucial question. I mean, because we do have to, the elections are really the single most important source of legitimacy for our government. And, even though we don't do compulsory voting, certainly if you have numbers substantially below a certain threshold voting, it does really cast a certain shadow on the legitimacy of the government that we elect. So if substantially fewer than say 50% of the voters out of fear or out of concern or out of fear of intimidation, whatever, choose not to show up and get the idea that the election is a much higher risk than the voter registration, which it is, just on the face of it, and therefore do not show up. And you get a government elected by, say, less than a certain number of the population, it would be elected, and yet its legitimacy would be substantially weakened. So yes, participation is important. Voter participation is really a very crucial factor. And I think that's why, you did ask Bridget earlier on about the campaigning and the effect on the campaigning, especially from the side of the candidates and the parties. But I think, also the point about not waiting for voting day to roll out all of these new protocols around how the voting will occur. I think there's an intervening period between voter registration and voting day. This intervening period, the campaigning period, is really also the period to reinforce behavior modification, because behaviors have actually almost relaxed. We really have gone back years. You see trotro vehicles now, you look into them, the driver is not wearing a face mask, most of the passengers are not. It's clear that people have relaxed. Now, so how we conduct the campaign is just as important a source of lessons going into the elections as how we conducted the registration. So with the campaign, I think we could use it as an opportunity to reinforce the message that, look, we have still to be very careful because the behavior modification that we're able to reinforce during this period, if we are insistent that there are no rallies, you know, I haven't seen yet a full rollout of election-specific regulation or protocols coming out of Imposition of Restrictions Act yet. But maybe we need to have specific rules tailored to campaigning before, of course, the Electoral Commission and the parties agree on the protocols for the election. So that if there are not going to be rallies, and this is going to be a retail type of election where people just walk house to house, there must be rules around that. So for example, in Benin, they had local elections in May, and it was all media run. It was all media elections, but also vehicular elections, right? So you have media, and then you could use a public address system in a vehicle to do your rounds and deliver your broadcast and messages that way. But the state threw in the light of COVID, also threw in a subsidy for the parties and the candidates to be able to do so, right? Because we also have to really think about the real issue here, which is that even in normal times, we do have our elections in terms of level playing field. We do have unfair advantages for the incumbent. That also remains, and in fact, one might say it's actually even exacerbated by COVID, because while, say, the president has the use of the bully pulpit, has the use of a national address, and opposition candidates do not have the same resource or opportunity. And, you know, for whatever it's worth, you know, it's easy to say, I mean, it's about public health, but some will read political messages into even those broadcasts and say that, look, you are campaigning and our hands are tied. So we have to begin to have rules around how we're going to do the campaigning, both from the side, but also to signal to the electorate that, you know, we still have to be in behavior modification mode, not wait for new protocols for election, but even in the campaigning. I think it's very important to reinforce the behavior modification lessons during the campaigning, because if we wait for 3 months, 4 months, and then roll out new rules, all of a sudden you have to be careful again. That's not going to work. I mean, these things take some time for people to use them in terms of the behavior change. So I expect during the election, I would be really happy to see during the campaigning season, a new set of agreed rules. And this time around, I think because it involves level playing fields between parties, this would not be the kind of I would expect to be done by fiat, but by some consensus building among the political class and with the Electoral Commission, that these are going to be the rules of engagement for the campaign. And then that consensus that has been developed will be developed during this period, then will roll into the development of another set of protocols for the election day itself. But we really need to
From what you said, are these engagements happening? You know, the IPAC, because it seems we are not hearing much at all, and it's just 3 months.
I said unless
the election.
No, unless they are happening behind closed doors, there are no leaks and all of that. Which is quite not how things work here. Unless they are happening that way, I don't have any signal that they are happening. There are a number of election-related meetings that the EC calls every then. I haven't seen yet these issues flagged, but I think these are not just purely administrative issues, especially around the campaigning. The issues around campaigning and how we're going to do it are really political issues. They're not issues easily governed by administrative fiat either. So you really do need all the stakeholders on the party and candidate side to really sit down and haggle over the rules and how we're going to engage, especially because different participants have different concerns around abuse of incumbency or unfair advantage for the incumbent and the like. I mean, knowing that rallies are almost a no-no if you are not able to have the same exposure by media, then you appear to be advantaged. And are we going to have, rules? Are we going to throw in some little support for the parties? Are we going to factor in support for the election campaign, the same way we've done with, say, support for SMEs and other parts of the economy?
Right.
Are we going to support democracy with some new stimulus for democracy, especially around the campaigning? These are all questions that I think we need to haggle about, and the political class needs to be about doing. I mean, really, the absence of conversation and the absence of dialogue within the political class around this actually is a source of concern.
Very well. If you have just joined us, you are live and you're watching us as part of the University of Ghana School of Law's election crisis. What was it? I've even forgotten the name of the seminar. Can you imagine?
Law in crisis.
Law in crisis. Oh, it's old age. Don't mind me. So the Law in Crisis seminar series. This is the second installment focusing specifically on election matters. And for our session, we are looking at elections in pandemics, exploring pathways to innovative elections management. We have as our panel Bridget Jogbenuku, who hopefully would become the presidential candidate for the Progressive People's Party. That's Dr. Papa Kwesi Ndum's political party. We have Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh of the CDD and Nana Kwachi, who is a research and doctoral fellow of the New York University. We are streaming live on the University of Ghana Law in Crisis Facebook page. We're on YouTube as well. And this program has been brought to you by Kind KC, University of Ghana School of Law, with support from the Star Ghana Foundation, and thanks also to UKAID and the European Union. You're welcome to drop your questions, and I'll be happy to read them for my panel members to address them. Bridget, I'm coming back to you now. Maybe you're even sitting and saying that we don't know what's going. Me, Kwesi, and Nana don't know what's on the ground, because you are on the ground. You are the political party. You have to execute a political party campaign and seek the mandate of the citizens. You are a smaller party, which means your challenges are even more pronounced. From what we've discussed so far, listening to the public health concerns and the concerns towards ensuring credible, legitimate, transparent, accountable election in the face of these wide, ranging, sweeping restrictions, what might be your ideas for the Electoral Commission and for the political parties themselves? That's one. And two, are you even having these conversations amongst yourself in terms of the political parties regarding what you want?
Well, yes, I think that for what we might want, I outlined a few of them earlier about segmenting the voters and letting, making sure that some of them come in at a certain time just to ensure that there's no spread of the virus and things like that. But also, H. Kwesi Prempeh mentioned something about rallies and how it's going on. Because we can't have large crowds, it's not safe to have large crowds, and indeed nobody's doing that a lot. Some are, but the thing it would be to use a lot of the tools that we have, like social media. And indeed, I mean, the Electoral Commission came up after the registration to say a large number of our electorates, or the majority of our electorates, are the youth, who are actually quite dependent on social media. And therefore, that would be a very good medium to use. Of course, we're sharing this with the opposition as well. So everybody would be reliant on social media. I think that we had a Congress where we had to announce our executives. And in doing that, we had a small crowd with a lot of the traditional media represented, socially distanced, outdoors, all the protocols were observed, and ensured that we had social media links where our supporters from the other regions could gather in small groups and also sign on to these social media sites so that they could observe what was going on. And that is the way it should go. I like the part that H. Kwesi Prempeh mentioned about something that happened in Benin, where the government actually gave political parties a certain budgets or some funding to work with. And that would really work well here, because you see, what we want is that we want the health, we want the best for our citizens, not it goes beyond competition now and it becomes a collaboration, more or less, because it's the people of Ghana that we are concerned about. And therefore, if you say you're working in the interest of the people of Ghana, then we all must ensure that we all are safeguarding the health of the people. And therefore, if you're going to fund anything to ensure that, to safeguard that health, they should go for all the political parties and all their political or some of their political activities. I think that when we had the first cases of COVID and the country went on lockdown, the presidents called us, political parties, to dialogue and find a way in which to fight COVID. And it was a nice conversation and we all gave ideas as to what to do. But at the end of the day, whatever funding they got to fight COVID was completely controlled by the government, the party in government. And I think that would have been a good way to say, look, all you political parties have a certain percentage of the electorate, and this would be a way to push you to also go out there and not attract your people, but spread the word about keeping safe and fighting COVID. So something like that, yes, is important. We the smaller parties are bleeding and are suffering, and the ruling party always, or that those who've been in government before, do have more resources than we do. But when it comes to COVID, and like the president said, COVID has no political colors. Coronavirus is everybody. Then we should have them understand that it goes beyond competition now, and the words I used in that meeting was, it goes beyond competition. It's now a compassionate thing. Everybody is Ghanaian in this case, and the resources to help in this activity should go around to each party. So whilst we are trying to find ways around it because we don't have the resources, we are finding tools. And like I keep saying, I choose to see the glass half full. We want to see the opportunities that this dreadful disease has brought to us and take advantage of them. It will also be good and advantageous to the rest of us and the rest of the country if all the political parties are strengthened in a certain manner so that their political activities does not go to spread COVID.
But I mean, would you agree to those who say that perhaps this is even good for the smaller parties, because somehow COVID is a leveler. It has kind of like leveled the playing ground for the political parties. This time they can't get to expend huge amounts of money on, a huge budget item activity. So at least there's some opportunity there for you, not so?
No doubt. Like I said from the beginning, the first thing I said was COVID has given us a lot of opportunity. That's my glass half full there. But if we also had the opportunity to go on GTV every 2 weeks to talk to our fellow Ghanaians, we would also have something to say, and we would also be heard, and yes, maybe this is the time from now on, whilst we are campaigning, the media should, and I think we still spoke about that in the last forum, H. Kwesi Prempeh and I were, that we should be given equal time by the media to come and say, and we may not, it's not a vote for me kind of thing. It's more like, we care about your safety too. And because that is what it seems to be saying. But look, Shamima, between you and I, if you go on social media and you look at the COVID safety measures that they put out there, and people have posted on their pictures, look at those colors. Most people don't pay attention to it, but look at those colors again and come back and tell me.
Serious branding there.
You see? So
the subtle art of branding.
yes, you see, they observe the COVID protocols, but look at the colors in which they come. And I've had to draw people's attention to that. Do you realize those colors there are? And unfortunately, at this time, I'm not so politically skewed as to see every color as an opposition color, but it's the truth. That is what persists. And maybe this is when we also, as a smaller party,
should also do some. As for the
yes, we'll do some.
We'll do some.
We'll do some. Yes. Yes, and we probably, we'll have to look at it and do it. But my point is, as Kwesi Prempeh said, the party in government has the resources and does most of it. But like you said, it's a leveler, and we all have to then be dependent on social media. Thankfully, that is not always a huge budget, and we can take a look at that and relook at doing things. I mean, we thank God that the one thing, as much as I'm a politician, the one thing that used to disturb me a lot was the noise. And so far, so good. I mean, we still have September, October, and November to go, and maybe the noise levels will come up. But at least we don't have the rallies going on and the lots of people who will, who may get infected. But yes, it gives us an opportunity to do things differently and properly.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Let me bring our participants in at present. We have a few questions from them. We thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us on this seminar series. Vera Haibo says, what time frame will be prudent for the Electoral Commission to present, publish detailed outline or guidelines for the elections for scrutiny, because it's only 3 months to election? That's the big headache and the big question we're all asking today, Vera. Thanks for sending that through. Colonel Festus Abuachi, retired, says, it is arguable that lessons from the just ended voter registration exercise showed acts of intimidation and voter suppression by the security forces, especially by elements acting outside the established framework for election security. In the run-up to December 7 and on election day, how can we ensure that the activities of the Election Security Task Force and other security forces do not interfere with the right of citizens to exercise their franchise? Marilyn Arumadri Baku says, if the citizens are failing to follow the simple protocols, how is the Electoral Commission going to ensure that people follow the rules they will roll out during the elections? You wonder. I'm seeing these not applicable at all, you opine. Even if they use the security institutions, the personnel are equally tired, to say that in the Nigerian tone. The country must prepare for another landing of many positive patients, not few, by the way. So yes, I think we can take these ones for now. And yeah, any one of you can take that.
Okay, I can jump on the first question about when we should start a consultation. And I think that I'm picking up on that because of listening to what Professor Prempeh said and what Madam Bridget said as well. I think it's quite obvious that that should have happened. That should be happening right now. It should have happened already, because it's not just a question of agreeing on, okay, here are the public health guidelines. It's also important that there's some agreement on the scenarios for December 7th and what will be done under any of those scenarios, for there to be consensus on those as political questions as well. And it's not possible to, like we said, we've all agreed on, it's not possible to, there's never a time that's too early to have that conversation, but there is a time that is too late. So it's important, I think, if we haven't started it, if it's not happening behind closed doors, that really begins as soon as possible, really. I think any I think any average Ghanaian would be hoping that that is happening, to be honest.
Kwesi? Hello, Kwesi.
I think he's
Yes,
muted.
I
Okay.
agree. I agree with Nana Kwachi. I mean, I think definitely this is a conversation that should be happening right now, and I really do hope to it. I mean that we could take advantage of the exceptional circumstances presented by COVID to also advance, an aspect of our election management and democracy generally that I think it's almost a bit standing on very wobbly feet now, which is the issue of inter-party dialogue. IPAC seems to be fraying at the seams, and I think there's an opportunity for the EC to continue to build confidence with all the parties. So I'm hoping that we start this conversation now under the auspices of the EC, that it be an open kind of dialogue, an opportunity for the parties to agree. It would be really bad if we miss the boat in terms of the timing and then just came out with a fiat, whether administratively from the EC or politically or legally from the government, saying these are the rules. This is a moment for maximum consultation, for maximum dialogue and consensus building around.
Hello, Kwesi. I think your network is failing us a bit.
Very, very thorny issues.
Hello?
So I really want to hope that the time. Okay. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, I mean, the last parts of your submission
So
were a bit mumbled.
No, so I'm saying that basically I agree with Nana Kwachi that we so in terms of how we do it, that I hope that it is done with the maximum consultation, no preconditions, just maximum deliberation among the parties, so that the outcome that we agree is a product of real dialogue among the parties, as opposed to being seen by one or the other group as an imposition by executive fiat or by administrative fiat. And I think if we're able to get into the last stage of the election value chain or the cycle,
okay,
with some more confidence building, more on it. So don't think we should be locked into this idea of a single day election. There's nothing that
you are saying some very important things, but the network is bad, Kwesi. So let me go to Bridget, and hopefully so that we don't lose out on the very important key points you're making. Bridget, before you come in, let me throw in a few more questions. That there's one particular one that perspective that I find very interesting. So this one from YouTube says, this is the first election under the Fourth Republic where international observers may not be able to participate, or if they participate, their ability to move around and engage stakeholders will be limited. To what extent will this impact how political actors conduct themselves? And this is coming from YouTube. There's no name, but I think this is a very important intervention you have just made. After seeing the congestion on the first 2 days of voter registration, nothing can convince me that 7th December elections will be any better. The Electoral Commission of Ghana must decongest all polling centers to at least 3 centers. And this is coming from Grassac National Synod. Thank you for the conversation. I also think it's a shame that a conversation about Plan B is not taking place. What is it, for what it is worth? I think even if we do not get a worst case scenario, the possibility of it gives an opportunity to engage in that conversation and derive some options for the future. I believe the legal community must do this, even if the politicians will not. Thank you, Wilma Osei, for this one as well. Bridget.
Uh-oh. Yes, yes, Shamima.
Mhm. You can address any of the questions.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, let me say, I think there was this question about, I think a lot of us are thinking what could go wrong rather than what could go right. I think generally from our numbers, we know that we are not doing too badly where COVID is concerned. And like I keep saying, they're going to open the borders now, but it's good for us to keep a more positive approach or a positive outlook on the oncoming elections. It's easy to say and it's almost flippant, but I think that the more we think what could go wrong, the more we look out for what could go wrong. I think I saw a question from Festus Abwajan, hello, say, which said, how can we guarantee that the security forces in charge of the elections behave and do not, I think that sometimes even some of the security forces who are there to ensure safety are expecting something to go wrong and therefore are very much on edge. I don't know if that's what security demands that you do, but I think that let's take a step back. Let's see how the elections go. Sometimes people think, oh, because you, the small parties, have nothing at stake. Sure, we do have something at stake. You know what happens to us sometimes at the polling stations? Because we don't have enough polling station attendants to put, we don't have enough people to put at our polling stations. We lose out on some of our votes, and you know what they say about the vote, the elections are won at the polling stations. We lose out on some of our votes. But I think that generally, if we all go suspicious of things that could go wrong, we actually cause those things that could go wrong. And sometimes we must go all expecting to do what is right by us. I feel that sometimes the Ghanaians, we want to be headed in a certain way. When we actually know what ought to be done right, you know that you need to go to the polling station, you know that you need to wear your mask, you know that you need to be socially distanced. These messages have been repeated over and over again, whether there are elections or not. Yes, like my other panelists said, the Electoral Commission ought to have started the education of or letting us know what they were going to do on December 7th, starting now. They ought to let us know whether it's going to take a day, whether it's going to take 3 days, because you see, the closer it gets to the time, and the more suspicious people get when you bring all these new modalities, and then especially the two major parties, somebody then starts to think, oh, you're doing this to disenfranchise us. So they should give us a lot of time, give us a lot of information, and we should also see it in good faith as an opportunity to run our elections in a better way. But if with the other parties, all these new modalities come out, and I think that, if I should say, the EC is probably being careful because of what would be read into these new modalities they want to put in place to safeguard the voter. Maybe what they should actually say is walk into that space to say, this is what we are doing for these reasons. Because it seems as if each time something new is being put in place, people get immediately suspicious. And as soon as you get suspicious, that is when the ideas of disrupting it or getting violent about it come up. So let's look at it in good faith. And that's what I wanted to say. Let's look at it in good faith. Let's see how better it makes our electoral process. And yes, all these questions will come up, but I think it's also individual responsibility, because you know what you want. You know that you want an election free of violence. You want an election free and fair. And you want to ensure that you go to your polling station and come back not infected. And therefore, you take personal responsibility to ensure that that doesn't happen. I remember when the lockdown was lifted, there were some people who said, oh, we are being left on our own to fall sick. And I was asking them, don't you think you have a part to play in this process to ensure that you don't fall sick? Must it be that you must only be put under lockdown to ensure that you don't fall sick? And I think that majority of Ghanaians have actually ensured their safety through that. And the same should go for the electoral process. Yes, EC must put out the modalities and put in the budget if the funding to ensure that the protocols are observed. But the average Ghanaian also has, or the voter also has, a personal responsibility to yourself first and foremost to ensure that these things go right. And that would be my answer to all the people who are in fear asking, the questions in a bit of negativity.
Right. Kwesi, I hope your network is correct now. So, I mean, the question about this might be the first election that we may not have the involvement of international observers as we used to in the past, and what it portends for behavior or misbehavior of political actors on the ground.
We do have a very strong domestic election observation structure. I mean, CODEO, if I may say so myself, which is a coalition of domestic election observers, a large coalition of various civic professional groups, spanning clergy, Christian, bar association membership, all of that, which is headquartered here at CTV. We've been doing election observation in the country, international observers participating in our observation group. These are all Ghanaians, and we've been doing that for many years. So I think we have the capacity. Certainly, if there are other international parties who are interested in our elections and observing alongside us, that's good, but we do have the ability to do this. We are currently actually doing it. We're already in the field doing training for election observation. We observed a part of the registration exercise and are already gearing up for the elections as I speak. So we are ready to do election observation. We also have our parallel voter technology that we also roll out alongside the election, which gives us some measure of another tool by which we can also vet the credibility of the numbers that we're getting. So I think, our elections, I think we've gone beyond the point where we have to depend on international observers to validate or authenticate the integrity of our elections. I think we have built enough domestic capacity, but I think they're welcome if by then there's an opportunity for them to participate.
Kwesi, I agree that CODEO has been quite effective over time, but because again of the nature of our politics, you do know that always the international observers also add a certain modicum of legitimacy to the outcome, right? Because of the ways that our landscape often wants to tag person A or person B to that. So do you think that their absence might cast a certain shadow over the elections, or you believe that not at all?
I don't want it to be, I don't want to pit domestic election observation against international election observation. I have had the opportunity to participate in international election observation in other countries, most recently in Zimbabwe in the first post-Mugabe elections. There is value to that. I mean, there is value to having as many as possible, as many people and independent groups as possible looking in and all of that. But of course, sometimes having too many can create a problem, because you then have a situation where, one says, the election looked okay to me here, the other comes up with a different report. I mean, so there are pluses and minuses there. But I do think that we generally, as a country, we are very aware that the international community takes a very keen interest in our elections. You know, we are one of the countries most observed, whether directly physically on the ground or from a distance. Our elections really do generate a considerable amount of international interest.
Why?
And therefore, well, I think that because there is a certain sense that we have become whether a beacon of stability in the region, our example in terms of repetitive, generally peaceful elections and handover of power, I think has earned us some kind of favor with the international community when it comes to the conduct of elections. But they're also always aware. I mean, I think people have observed our elections long enough to know that we always get on the precipice as if we're going to just, you know, trip over and descend into some kind of uncharacteristic chaos. It never does happen, but there is always tension. So we do get people very interested in how things are going, wishing us well, I think, all the time, but they are also aware that, you know, things can just go bad. And we too are aware. And I think sometimes because we're aware that we're being looked at, that also affects the way we conduct our affairs. So I think or not election observers, international observers are on the ground in Ghana, I think that we are aware of the atmosphere in which we are operating. And CODEO has done a marvelous job historically in actually overseeing these elections, observing these elections. So I don't expect that the absence of election observers, if that's what happens, will actually in any way detract from the legitimacy of the outcome or the observations that CODEO makes about the validity of the outcomes. Remember that we roll out the same things we do with Afrobarometer. We go out and get public perception. So we come to this with a good deal of credibility as a research organization, and therefore, you know, I do not really doubt at all that we can do this without the presence of the international observers.
Very well. We are doing very good with time, and we are covering almost all the areas, but the next bit I might want to take your thoughts on is the issue of special voting. And Kwesi, since you're still on the floor, you know, in the beginning of the conversation, we're speaking about, you know, exploring other innovative pathways. Do you think the vehicle of special voting is one of such pathways?
Yes, oh, absolutely. I think we do have in our normal election day routine, but we've tended to have it mostly for security personnel, especially those who are going to partake in the in security work on election day. We've had them voting a day or some days prior to election day. And I think this is a facility that we should consider extending, especially to voters in certain high-risk categories or voters who have mobility challenges on election day that they may not be disenfranchised. So this has been done in other countries that have held elections in the midst of COVID. So we too, I think, should take a leaf from that book. And essentially, I would suggest, I think Bridget had earlier mentioned that, you know, the elderly or senior citizens, as we call them here, and the persons with disabilities and other vulnerable groups. I mean, we can have them join with the security personnel. It will do, you know, it will do a good bit to reduce election day queuing and the numbers on election day. I think even during registration, I do know that, you know, the Electoral Commission asked that could go to their district offices. Maybe that it would take somebody the whole ride to get there. So that's not as easy, but they did open a window for persons above 60, later drop to 50, to go to their district office as opposed to going to queue in the registration centers. So definitely special this kind, I think, something that we ought to we ought to do. But I think we should also seriously consider the number of days over which we are going to do this election.
What do you
If we're
suggest?
going to do multiple days, really, we need to build. I do think that this is a conversation, so we have to have the public health people with the EC and the political class sitting together around this, and just looking at the reality, the data, and everything, and then seeing, look, can we accomplish a single day election? I think even in normal times, we've had situations where sometimes elections have rolled over beyond the day. And when that happens, you see that it changes the conversation around, cheating and rigging, and there's a lot of rumor mongering around what's going on. So if we're going to have an election, the election extend beyond the day, we must begin to build and arrive at political consensus about that soon enough.
Are you not fearful of that option, given our history, ballot snatching, people sleeping with ballot boxes throughout the night just to protect the ballot?
No, I don't think I would say I am afraid. I mean, I think it is an exceptional situation, and therefore we have to prepare for it. It's a challenge that we may have to confront. And rather than wait last minute to just shoot a surprise and say, oh, by the way, we're going to have election on December 7th. If you don't December 8th, if you don't finish December 9th, no, we should have a clear roadmap on this, clear decision about that. That if this is how we're going to do it, this is when it opens, this is when it closes, this is how we're going to keep custody, the chain of custody of the ballot boxes, this is how we're going to work everything out. I don't want any of this to become a surprise. It's where there is a surprise. That's where the suspicion and the skepticism and the concerns arise.
But with 3 months on, when do you think might be too late if these conversations don't begin? By when do you think it might be too late to do them?
I think because I am essentially preaching consensus, I do not want decisions around such issues to be made by fiat, by imposition. So to the extent that they are being made, in my view, ideally by consensus, I think the time to start it is now. If it goes into November, because the various, parties are doing their own internal polling, they are getting a sense of how the numbers are shaking out in the populace, if nobody wants to wait and then one side just says, hey, we will have a one-day election. And when you start building consensus in November, it's unlikely that you will probably arrive at a decision by November. So start building it now. Anticipate that it's going to be difficult, take a lot of deliberation. It's going to take a lot of give and take. So why not start it now? Latest, somewhere mid-September, so that you can have it way ahead of time. Way ahead of time. As trying to wait until then, then the consensus breaks down, which is what happened, for example, with the referendum vote last year. The consensus building around the political party, whether or not we're going to have the referendum on the election of MMDC, that consensus building did not take place early enough. And when it got close to the election and the parties realized we don't have a consensus to push this through, then we were faced with a failed referendum. I don't want that in around this.
Yes, let them hear. Let me say that on the series, we reserve a virtual seat for the Electoral Commission. You'll recall that I said this is the election series. So we are looking at different facets of our election accountability, election management. There'll be sections on the transitional, process. And we've been wanting to host the Electoral Commission, but it's been difficult to get any of their representative, come on. So we have a virtual seat for them anytime at all that they are willing, happy, and able to come on any of the series or sessions. We're happy to host them. Kwesi, thanks so much for that. Let me come to you. Nana Kwakye, we are about wrapping up. So in the next round, we should be thinking about the summaries of our key takeaways with respect to the issues we have spoken about, public health, safeguarding our democracy, but most importantly, things we can do before, during, and after the December 7th elections to ensure that we protect our democracy and we protect the health of our citizens, and what role law might play in cementing all of these facets together. So Nana Kwashi, again, are there any special arrangements in a special, voting situation, you would say?
Well, I think obviously any scenario where just if we don't have a vaccine, which we probably will not by December 7th, any scenario where voting means that it can't actually look like what we usually do, because what we usually do is crowds, long queues. That's not going to work. So we have to make some changes in some ways by learning lessons from the voter registration exercise about queue management and people management, and applying them in their most practical sense to the actual election. Like Professor Prempeh was saying, it might mean we have to vote for multiple days. Like Madam Bridget was saying, it might mean that we have to have special voting or early voting for vulnerable people. But we need to think through all those things now, because we are going to need to do some of them. There's no scenario where we don't do any of them and just go and have the election. We're going to have to do some of them. And because we have to do some of them, we're going to have to come to a consensus. We're going to have to make sure that the public understands why those things are being done. And like has been said here, the earlier we get to that effort, the better. But the guiding principles from a strict public health perspective has to be to make sure that the most vulnerable people are exposed the least, so they are getting to polling stations on a priority basis and spending the least time there. So the elderly, people with known conditions that are high risk, we want to make sure that when people are at the polling stations, that there is sufficient room around them to do effective social distancing as part of queue management. And we want to make sure that there is some amount of screening to make sure that people who are coming into the line, what we did in the EC, in the registration process, was doing the thermal screening. It's not fail-proof, but it's a good measure to see who is sick and has a fever, which is a good screening metric. We should do that too, to make sure that we are reducing the likelihood that somebody who enters a queue, enters a polling area, is infected in the first place. But we need to do all those things at the same time. We need to do them everywhere, and we need to make sure that there's people responsible for enforcing them. Whatever modalities we come up with for enforcing those public health objectives, whether by multiple day voting, by special queuing allocations, by more polling centers, whatever we do, those are administrative questions. But the goal should be to make sure that, people can practice good hand hygiene, they can practice effective social distancing, and that we are reducing the risk of people coming to polling stations when they're infected. Those are the goals. So how we get there, that's a question for the EC, for political parties, and for public health consultants to both, to sit down together to look at what reality says and respond to that reality with some meaningful measures here. I've said previously that I think COVID-19 for every country really presents a test of your national character. It's not just a question of what happens in healthcare, what happens in pandemic management. It's going to test how well you are at building consensus. If you say you're a democracy, can you do the hard work of making sure that you are actually doing the dirty work of democracy, talking to people even when it's hard, especially because it's hard, so that everybody's at the right place? Can you do the necessary work to make sure that the fact that putting in place measures for the election is going to be difficult is not the reason you don't do them? We have to make sure we are rising to the moment. We have to make sure that we are doing that by responding again to reality, by being pragmatic, by being flexible, and by valuing consensus, because it's quite clear that a lot of the public health hamstrings as far as the election goes has to do with the preparedness of political actors to comply and to go along and to promote those things. And if we are not in a place where we can build trust and consensus among those actors, and if there's not enough trust among the referee between those actors, we need to see how we'll have a difficult situation in December. So it's a question of what can we do now as well to prepare for that. So it's not, and again, so yes, we want to make sure we can keep infections down. It definitely means we have to be testing more than we are, just as a plain fact, a concern I have. We have to be testing more, we have to be doing more aggressive contact tracing, and we have to be considering how to mitigate the risks that are involved with opening the airport which I think, quite frankly, should include some period of mandatory quarantine. Those are the things we can do to control infections. But to control the panic around the elections or the anxiety around the elections, there are political things we have to be doing now, which involve the engagement with all the stakeholders, the consensus building, the pragmatism, the flexibility, and the candor, the plain candor to make sure that everybody feels like they're being heard, that their opinions are being valued, and that what's driving decision-making about what we do is what works, what is good for the people, and not what is expedient, what is seen to be expedient for the EC or one party or the other.
Beautifully said. And I think that we ought to have begun yesterday. Obviously, we don't have much time left. Thank you so very much, Nana Kwache, for those very beautiful and thought-provoking interventions. Bridget, I'm coming to you now by way of summary of your key takeaways and your key recommendations, bearing in mind, global best practice as well. How should political parties proceed?
Well, I think that the one thing I said was, to some extent, we must take responsibility, each one of us, and from the individual basis and then to the party basis. Nobody wants a largely infected population of COVID patients. So we must take personal responsibility and take responsibility on the part of the parties. And I think most of us have done. We are careful as to how to go about our rallies and our campaigning, and we won't do a lot. We won't do as much in-person campaigns as we would in normal times. We were taking a lot online. We are taking a lot to the media, and on the day of voting, like I said, nobody knows who's there to vote for which party. So we must be interested in everybody's participation, ensure that people are not disenfranchised by the whatever new modalities are going to go in place. I think Kwesi Prempeh said it. This is the time to start the dialogue, because we don't want to push it and then something that we are not used to. I think I heard one of you talk about culturally or traditionally. We don't like change. So sudden change in a short time is difficult for us to handle and to deal with. So let's know that because of COVID, certain things are going to change from now on. And it's a pity that the EC did not show up for this conversation, but I'm sure that the conversation will go to them, where it has to start now for us to understand and believe that these things are being put in place because they are concerned about the Ghanaians' health and not for political expediency, for example. And at the end of the day, each one of us, regardless of which political party we belong to, must be responsible. I think we saw what happened with the registration process when a minister went to a registration center knowing that he was COVID compromised, positive. And it wasn't the very responsible thing to do. And all of us must take that personal responsibility. It goes beyond the party, it becomes an individual thing. Of course, we, the parties, want our votes. So we also must put in place certain things to ensure. We must look out for certain things, probably the protocols. Everybody is there in a mask. The place is properly socially distanced, if you like. The 2-meter rule is being obeyed. There are hand washing basins, either before or after the ballot box, and all that, so that we know that each person in their place, including the security forces, are ensuring if there's somebody there not in a mask, they must not be allowed to join the queue. And it's not a fight, it's it's just the thing to do. I think that recently Nana Kwache talked about the bars. You drive past bars or you drive past marketplaces, and people have shed the mask. Yes, they've shut their mask and they are sitting close, and I'm thinking, don't you know what is going on? They
No,
do, but
they don't care.
yes, on December 7th, this is what we have to ensure, and it's not a fight. It's just, well, maybe it should be no mask, no vote, if you like, and that should be enforced. But the EC will have to come out as quickly as possible to make sure we hear all that, not the day before or not the month before. And I hope that even whilst we are sitting here thinking, why haven't they joined us? I am hoping that ever the optimist, I'm sure that they are doing something at the EC and we'll hear about them.
Right. Ever the optimist. I like that bit. I mean, what we focus on becomes our reality. I'm also a sucker for that, positive thinking. But sometimes the challenges can be so overwhelming, you can't even help yourself. So, Kwesi, before I bring you in, let me just take a few more comments and then we will, okay, this is the wrong place I should open chat. Just give me a minute. Okay, Nelson says, as we look forward to meeting our electoral commitments under public health pandemic conditions, what should the model for a future crisis smart election management look like? Thank you. In fact, that's a question I should have asked of them, looking into the future. What
Online.
should
Online.
I like it. Crisis smart elections management look like? Emmanuel Arthur says, is the option of e-voting available for us? In the worst case, you wonder. Vera says there have been rumors. Well, I don't like talking about rumors. So Vera, since it's a rumor, I can't read it publicly. Okay, I hope you understand. So yes, Kwesi, you can box in the questions as well as your summary of your key takeaways and call to action. Or Bridget, did you want to say something again?
No, when someone asked about what is the future of elections, I said online. The world is moving that way, and I know that the US is struggling with it, and all the postal things and all that. But we must face our challenges and deal with them. And sometimes some of these things will just have to go digital, if not not all of it, some of it. That would be the future. I mean, right. The future is now.
Yeah, and if okay.
Okay, wait, Nana, Kwesi, wait, let Nana finish because you will wrap up the session anyway. So Nana should just have his take, yeah.
Okay, just to go off what Madam Bridget said, I think the question of where we are going, I mean, that's a conversation we really have to be having. This COVID presents many countries with opportunities to innovate around how we do things, and it presents us a good opportunity to question, the strength of our institutions and what we can do with those institutions to make sure that scenarios like this can be better contained. For example, that in 2018, Sierra Leone, during their election, they actually used blockchain technology as part of the digital coalition, digital voting measures. So, and with that technology, that made it so that they were less worried about hacking and many of the other things that would usually go into consent about a digitized or digital election. But there are options out there, and I hope that we are having. I hope that that's what's happening at IPAC. That I hope ideally be more constructive conversations about opportunities like that to look at how, if not now, in the next elections, we are bringing on board more of that, because that solves problems like making sure that Ghanaians abroad can vote. It solves problems like making sure that identity systems are in a place where they can be used as a basis for doing all that kind of ID verification, authentication. So it's an opportunity we really should think very constructively about, not just for the election per se, but for so many parts of our lives that are right now analog, that will be made so much easier, which we have seen can be made so much easier if we can get our institutions to be more trustworthy and for them to apply some of those technologies to make their work more efficient.
Thank you. Kwesi.
Yeah, so I think throughout this pandemic, certainly not just in Ghana, but I think globally, I think the essential balance, or at least the two key things foremost on our minds has been the health of the populace and the health of the economy. But I do think that there's a third pillar to this tripod, which is the health of a democracy. That's for those countries that are a democracy or that aspire to be one. I think the health of the democracy is also crucial. And Ghana especially, I think our democracy, whatever it's worth, it's been one of our strongest selling points in the region. It's a source of soft power for us. We get a number of interested investors, visitors, tourists come here because of our stability, our peace, which has been assured and guaranteed by our democracy. So I think we should prioritize the health of the democracy just as much as we have tried to prioritize the health of the economy during this pandemic. And as we look forward to 2020 December elections, this is, I think, just the right time for us to invest in the 2020 elections in an exceptional way in response to COVID. So I think I go back to my earlier points about consensus building, about beginning to think about a plan B now, about working out the modalities for campaign through consensus, about working out the modalities for voting day through consensus, and not do it by executive fiat, not do it by administrative fiat, but use this opportunity to really develop some widely accepted ground rules that all the stakeholders would buy into. I also think that the same way, I mean, I might have said it, just flippantly initially, but I do think that we also, investing in our democracy during this pandemic, must also think about some innovative ways, even if we're not going to do it as a permanent feature of our campaigns, at least some kind of a stimulus for election 2020 in the form of some new way of doing campaigning, because parties can no longer do rallies and they have to do more retail campaigning, if even that, or may have to do vehicular broadcast or more media. Perhaps some arrangements that would basically help parties with the new cost that this might impose would also be helpful. We can treat that as our stimulus, our COVID-19 stimulus for democracy or for the elections. So my main point is consensus. Time is of the essence. Let's begin to talk about now. Let's begin to talk about campaign ground rules. Let's begin to talk about election day ground rules now, as opposed to waiting until it becomes too late.
Thank you so very much. I think that we have done quite a bit. We've done quite well on time. And so we'll just wrap up the session. Of course, the conversation continues. So this session was just to allow us an opportunity to begin teasing out the key issues that has to occupy our minds and our conversations ahead of the December elections. Many thanks for joining us. H. Kwesi Prempeh, who is Executive Director for CDD Ghana. We also were joined graciously by Nana Kofi-Koachi, who is a research fellow and doctoral candidate at the New York University School of Public Health, as well as Madam Bridget Jogbenuku, who is a former vice presidential candidate and now presidential candidate aspirant for the Progressive People's Party. We have come to the end of our session and on elections and pandemics, pathways for innovative elections management. And what is clear is that there needs to be deeper consultation and engagement of all stakeholders by the Electoral Commission to ensure that we have a smooth election in a pandemic. I pray you have found the conversations very useful and good use of your time and will continue within your circles. Thank you. Special appreciation to our panel members for making the time, to the University of Ghana School of Law, and all who worked behind the scene to bring us a successful seminar, Oliver and his team. Many thanks to Star Ghana Foundation for supporting this series, as well as UKAID and European Union. The next series will be on post-election transition management. It would take place on the 7th of September 2020. That is a week from today. Make a date. My name is Shamima Muslim. As always, many thanks for your company and helping me do this work. Do enjoy the remainder of the day. Bye for now.